Welcome back. I'm joined now by two gentlemen with very different views on how to respond to white supremacists when they take to the streets. Mark Bray is a Dartmouth professor who has studied the Antifa anti-fascist movement. Antifa is a far-left political movement that argues it's necessary to confront hate groups, sometimes with force. Professor Bray is author of the new book, Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook. And Richard Cohen is the president of the Southern Poverty Law Center as an expert in hate groups, and he says direct confrontation simply leads to more of the kind of violence we saw in Charlottesville. Welcome to you both. I'm going to try to have this sort of debatey, so Mark Bray, I'll start with you. You seem to be a very small minority here who is defending the idea of violence, considering that somebody died in Charlottesville. Why do you defend confronting in a violent way?
Well, first, I would contest the notion that I'm that small of a minority. I think that a lot of people recognize that when pushed, self-defense is a legitimate response to white supremacist and neo-Nazi violence. And, you know, we've tried ignoring neo-Nazis in the past. We've seen how that turned out in the 20s and 30s. And the lesson of history is you need to take it with the utmost seriousness before it's too late. We've seen the millions of deaths that have come from not taking it seriously enough. And we can see that really the way that white supremacy grows, the way that neo-Nazism grows is by becoming legitimate, becoming established, becoming everyday, family-friendly, wear khakis instead of hoods. And the way to stop that is what people did in Boston, what people did in Charlottesville. Pull the emergency brake and say, you can't make this normal.
Richard, why do you believe this is a mistake?
I think it's a spectacularly bad idea to give one group of people the right to silence another group of people. It's contrary to our values embodied in the First Amendment. It's likely to drive the people who are trying to censor underground, where they may resort to illegal means to express themselves, like bombs. And lastly, it's likely to lead to a terrible spiral. We saw that in Berkeley. The Antifa came and shut down a speech. The next time, the white nationalists brought their own private army. And so, you know, where does something like that stop? Yesterday in Boston, you know, when we saw thousands and thousands of people peacefully protest, that seemed like a much stronger answer to white supremacy than clubs and guns.
Andy Young made the point, Mark, earlier in the show, that essentially there were those in the civil rights movement that wanted to confront violently, and he made the not so subtle reminder, they're not here anymore.
Well, there's a big difference between confronting fascism and confronting other forms of violence. So we can see that during the 30s and 40s, there was no public opinion to be leveraged by nonviolent resistance. If you get fascists to be powerful enough in government, they're simply not going to listen to the kind of public opinion that nonviolence can generate. That's the argument for resistance to Nazis. And the other point that I'll make is that a lot of people don't have the choice whether they can defend themselves or not. We've seen that even before this sort of, as you called it, spiral of violence started, there were attacks on mosques, there were attacks on synagogues. A lot of people are under attack, and sometimes they need to be able to defend themselves. It's not, you know, it's a privileged position to be able to say that you never have to defend yourself from these kinds of monsters.
You know, it's not an issue of defending yourself. It's an issue of trying to silence other people. No one is saying that, you know, if you're slugged in the face that you have to sit there and take it. The question here is when white nationalists want to walk down the street, should people stop them? And that's a very different issue. It's a very peculiar notion of self-defense to say you can censor people. Some
of the criticism of the Antifa movement, Mark, is that you're actually against speech. That you want to shut down this speech, and that borders on censorship.
Well, let's be clear that Antifa are not calling on the government to censor anyone. In fact, that they resist the notion of turning to the government or turning to the police, who we've seen have been infiltrated by white supremacists, who have been sympathetic to the sort of return to law and order notion of fascism. And so the idea is the real enemies of free speech are fascists. We've seen that historically. We've seen that they're the ones that, if they have their way, will shut down speech. And it also differs in the sense that anti-fascists see this as a political struggle. They don't see fascism as a difference of opinion or as kind of a different perspective to consider. Instead, they see fascists as the enemy, and I think that we need to come around to that notion, considering that there is no doubt what they've done historically.
Richard, I know the concern is that it makes martyrs out of the white supremacists.
Yes.
And it makes it, I mean, look, it drove one could argue that the Antifa movement helped the president make his arguments of, quote, both sides.
Sure.
Do you buy that?
Well, look, to some degree, there was a lot of ugliness that the Antifa brought there. And, you know, I think they play into the hands of the white nationalists who say, look, we're the ones who are embattled. The answer to bad speech is more speech. We saw it in Boston yesterday.
Well, we've seen that fail historically. I mean, fascism cannot be defeated through speech. And we can also see that, you know, Charlottesville did give attention to white supremacy, but it's not as if your average American can name any of the groups that were out there. Instead, we can see that they were unable to do the things that we see make movements grow, embed themselves in communities, establish networks, express their message. Instead, we see, and I can tell you from my book, from my research, there's a lot of empirical examples historically of anti-fascism working and stopping these groups from growing.
All right.